So thanks for coming. Welcome. We're excited to hear Jeff By speak a little about his inspiration and his process for his new body of work called American Roots. It's a celebration of fading Americana and a document of the decaying urban landscape. Jeff, as many of you know, Jeff graduated with a BFA from Rhode Island School of Design in 1993 and was selected by the European Honors Program to study abroad for a year in Rome. He earned his MFA from the Graduate School of Figurative Art in New York in 1996 and remained in New York for 15 years working in his own work. And
right. Well, working at the Metropolitan Opera, so as a scenic artist, so I did a lot of mural work and then always working with the movie sets and so forth. So in order to, it was flexible, so we worked for like 6 months on a project and then you have a couple months off, so that's when I dedicated my artwork.
So I'll
yeah.
just turn it right over to you. You're ready to go. So
all right, so thank you. I just want to say thank you for John and Kelly for hosting this. It's a great opportunity to speak in front of a lot of people about my work, talk about my process, talk about why I selected certain number of paintings and my interest in the urban landscapes and interiors and airports. If you've seen my work in the past, I've done airport paintings and things like that. So, you know, I just want to, it's a great opportunity to be able to speak in front of a crowd and explain certain aspects of the painting, like I said. Like Roy mentioned, I was at RISD and I lived in Italy for a year, and I think that's where my interest in walls and surfaces started to really come to fruition. So I just loved going into older buildings, chateaus, villas, and things like that. That wasn't really access to the public, but because of the RISD program, we got into a lot of these abandoned spaces, and that's what started to trigger my interest in these interiors and just how light starts to filter in these spaces. So as you can see, there's a good amount of work of a lot of different subject matter, from the American theater to mom and pop stores to interiors to cityscapes of Philadelphia, New York City, Baltimore, and Detroit. So you can see that there's a good variety. So, and interject. If you have a question about the paintings or the process, I love that. I love that interaction with the audience because it gets me going and it can go into a different direction. But as you can see, there's a good amount of work. There's probably around 12 to 13 pieces. And I mean, I think some of the focal points are the theater paintings. This is a newer series that I've been working on probably the last 5 years. And I've been able to get access to these abandoned theaters that have, you know, gone on to a decrepit state, and that's what interests me about going into these spaces. They feel very haunted, and they're very quiet. And then, yes.
Two quick questions. Are you still living in New York City?
No, I'm in Hershey, Pennsylvania now. So,
okay.
And that's good because it gives me access to Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York City. So it's within like 3 or 2 hours I'm in the city, and I can explore and continue to explore certain areas and neighborhoods of those cities.
My other one was simply, do you get a reference photo and then work entirely in your studio, or do you work on the spot?
Very good question. So when I get into these spaces, I do have a sketchbook. I do have a little watercolor set sometimes, so I can start to make notations of different colors, how it's affecting the interior, because if you do take images with your phone or your camera phone, it still alters the color and the value. So by being there and having some time and going back to these spaces several times, it allows me to start to make notations about the wall surfaces of the theater or of the floor surfaces, so I can make little color value studies, and then I use all that information and go back to the studio to create larger works of art.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. So the Everett Theater, this is in Hyde Park, Boston, and I got into this theater about a couple years ago, and I've always wanted to be in this theater. So I see other photographers shoot it, and a photographer like Matt Lambrous. I don't know if anyone knows who Matt is, but he has dedicated his whole life of documenting the American movie theater nationwide and also throughout Europe as well. So I got up with him, I got into a workshop with him, and I was able to get into the theater, and I started to take images, of course, doing notations with my sketchbook and my watercolor studies, and then going back at different times during the year. because the light affects the environment. One weekend it was very rainy out, so it was very dark in there, contrast to the summer where the light starts to filter in, because you can see how the light from the left, there's a hole in the ceiling, so you get this really nice direct light coming into the space and illuminating certain areas, like this area of the painting of the box seats with the green, and contrast to the, the decorative element of the wallpaper just grabbed my attention. So again, those surfaces, I start just to get really excited, and I want to start to document that. And then, of course, mom and pop stores. So this is down in Chinatown on Delancey Street and Orchard Street in New York City. And when I was living in New York in the early 90s, a lot of these mom and pop stores were just fascinating to me, because I loved going into different neighborhoods at that time, because they had their own culture, they had their own, the food, everything. So, and the just listening to the different sounds and so forth. So I started documenting, the mom and pop storefronts. So in Chinatown, to the west side, to the east side. So it's very different in terms of the environment. So I would just start to take those images, and I didn't know what I was going to do with them at first. But as things started to change in New York very rapidly, it was just something I really wanted to start documenting before they totally disappear. And this is what's happening in Philadelphia as well as Baltimore and so forth. Any questions at this time? Yes?
How did you come up with this idea of this liquid look that you get with floors?
Okay, that's a great question. So I like by just going through these old warehouses and so forth, and looking through the windows. They were very dirty and distressed, and I kind of like that, and I wanted to incorporate that into the work of art. So what I would do, I would have some washes, depending on how much pigment I'm putting into the wash. If it's more diluted, it's less intense. If I'm putting more paint, so I wanted these vertical strokes to start to break up the surface as well. So it gives that feeling. For example, this interior, it feels like, the plaster is falling from the ceiling, just having that movement in the painting. So contrast to maybe some others that I don't have all those soft values or washes that are happening in here, but you can see as you get closer that there is subtleties in terms of how those washes are presented in the painting, but not as dramatic as what was happening into that particular painting.
This actually might represent one, right?
Exactly. That's an interior of the TC Cake Factory in Philadelphia, and just getting into that space and having the water on the floor and having that liquid, yes, and by just working with the washes. This is an acrylic, by the way, compared to the oils, but they're very similar. You can't really tell in this, I told you that, but because just the quality of the paint has come up so much like oil. So in the early 90s, acrylic was really not up to the standards oil. You can see the differences right away between the contrast and the quality of the paint.
Okay, one more question.
Yeah, no.
How important is it to you that your work is recognizable? I mean, it is clearly recognizable. Is that important to you?
I think so. I think for me, I like to, there's an abstract quality too. If you go up very closely, it's very broken up in terms of how it's executed, but as you go further back, it all comes together. So yeah, I do want things that are representable, but at the same time, I do like that abstract quality, and I try to play around with the paint in order to get that balance or that variety into the painting.
I think what I meant was, your work is recognizable as your work, the way you do all these pictures.
Right.
There's no question about who it is. Really.
Right.
I've never seen anybody else's pictures look like this. That's an important thing?
Yeah, I think, representational is important to me. So observation, really making sure I'm getting those values correct. And as you get more experience, you're getting, your technique gets better. So that's something that's a nice evolution as you continue to work. Or you might go backwards and have things a little bit more abstract, or have more variation where everything is not so presented to you. So it allows the viewer to start to interact a little bit more into the paintings, if that makes sense.
Have you painted, or do you wish to paint homeless people, since so many of the areas where you're finding dilapidated buildings?
It's part of the environment, but it's not something I'm so drawn to, right, yeah. I love the buildings and the environment, and if that happens to, people are walking by or people that are very interesting, of course I'll confront them and go, hey, would you be interested in me taking images or doing some sketches? And most people are very friendly if you explain what you're doing. So, I've learned that very quickly in New York. If you start taking pictures, they're like, what are you doing, And then when you explain it, they're like, oh, oh, okay, you can do anything. So it's like, having that conversation with them and opening up to them and explaining or showing examples of your work, especially with the iPhone. Now it's very, back then you had postcards, back in the early 90s I didn't have access to an iPhone like we all didn't. So it wasn't, you would show them postcards or images of your paintings and so forth and explain what you're doing. And of course, having that dialogue with them and having that openness with them, they're very willing to have you start taking images or whatever. So, yes.
I got chased several blocks by a guy in New Bedford, Mass, who saw me holding my camera up from half a football field away, and he started screaming and shouting at me and demanding that I put away my camera.
Right. Well, it's also very, like if you're in New York City on Canal Street where there's so many people moving and there's so many cameras going and people are taking shots, you're not really noticeable. If you're in the corner tucking away, so you're kind of observing the situation. So it all depends on your environment, and who's around, and of course you adjust. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
So you switch back and forth between acrylic and oil.
Right.
Most people I know are in one camp or the other.
Right.
How do you choose which to use on what piece? Is that specific?
Right, that's a good question. I think it's timing. So when I'm teaching, I'm broken up. My schedule is very broken up. I'll be teaching Monday, and I have like a day to paint, and then I'm teaching again, and I have a couple of days off. So I try to work with the acrylic because I can work faster in terms of the paint. I can wipe away because things dry very quickly with acrylic. Okay, so and you can wipe away if you have like a white, like a wet rag. So this allows me to go quickly because of how fast it dries, and I can start to play around even more with acrylic compared to oil, where you have to let things dry, and then you have to, and then you can go back in, and then, but there is still that flexibility if you have a solvent, like especially I use Copley, which is a solvent, which is a medium, and like you add a little bit of the paint, depending how much Copley in, you get a wash with it, and you can start to soften up edges compared to make things a little bit more graphic. So yeah, I think it's timing, and that's how I start to flip back and forth between the. No, I like both, but I think I'm leaning more towards oil just because of the crunchiness of the paint and how you can layer, and it's very thick, and I kind of really like, again, with the surfaces that I'm doing, it makes more sense to, have that, that texture, and you get that with oil. It has that thickness compared to acrylic, which is a little bit more diluted. Okay. Yes?
Do you ever separate layers with medium so that paints don't interact?
Well, when I'm working with the oil, I just work with Copley and just turpentine.
I'm sorry, sir. Referring to acrylic.
Okay, with acrylic, I'm just using waters as my washes. So, the more water you put in, similar to the Copley, how much paint you put in, the lighter the wash. So if you're putting more pigment in, you're going to get a darker or, a more opaque wash compared to like.
You use acrylic mediums?
No, I don't. I have retarder, which just, prevents the paint from, drying up on the palette. But yeah, I don't use different, mediums. Yes.
How do you do your paintings, and what's your favorite part of them?
Oh, the most favorite part for me is like a beginning of a painting. I think there's so much things that can come of it, and I think it's the excitement of working on a new project, and I think that initial sketch on the painting is very exciting, and I think that beginning process is fun. As you keep working on your paintings, it becomes harder and harder because you're developing the work of art, and I usually have like 10 or 12 paintings going on at once, so I can rotate the paintings out. That's very helpful, is to get that distance from the work compared to some artists maybe just work on one painting at a time. I like to have that flexibility of having 10 or 15 paintings going on in the studio, flip them up, keep working on them, leave them alone for a while, go back so I can make those changes and not feel like I've spent so many hours on it. Certain artists can't do that. They become so precious with their work. So by having that distance from the work allows me to make those adjustments in the work. Yes?
How do you know when they're done?
Well, I leave them alone for a while. So I turn them away, and I might not look at them for a couple months, and then I'll go back. And if I see things that I still need to be adjusted, I'll keep working. And then when I'm there where I think, okay, I'm ready to move on, there is that, you know, you come to a conclusion, yeah, it's time. I think this is, it's what I wanted out of the painting. I had certain goals, I accomplished those goals, and I'm ready for the next project. So, but, and then of course, if you come over here, you can see that I do have nudes. So I love working with the figure as well, because I went to the School of Figurative Art down in Tribeca. So that's always been a passion of mine, is working with the figures. So, yes?
Your art education is in New York?
Well, I went to RISD for undergrad, and then I went to the School of Figurative Art down in Tribeca. So that was a smaller school that just focuses its attention with sculpture, drawing, and painting. And we just focused on the figure. We had more of a classical training, and I wanted that. I wanted to be able to do whatever I wanted to do in my head. So I wanted to have that like training to be able to mix any color, or get, you know, if I wanted to switch a figure, moving it to the left, and I didn't have that image, I could still do that with the knowledge of the anatomy. So, yes?
I have a question.
I teach at Penn State, Harrisburg, and then I teach at Elizabethtown College. So I teach basic drawing and painting classes, and sometimes an advanced painting class.
Oil or acrylic?
Oil and acrylic. Acrylic at Penn State, oil at E-Town, so there's that flexibility. So, and I prefer teaching in oil for beginning students, because then you're not focusing your attention on the palette and letting paint dry out, compared to oil, so they can actually start to focus more on the subject matter and getting the right values. So, yes, your question was?
2 questions. First, I guess, looking at these interiors from the theaters,
Right.
where, you know, when you went into these places, was this natural light?
Yes, natural light was coming through, yes.
Because this one feels, the light feels more like daylight filter.
Right, because, yeah, there's a hole in the ceiling over here to the left.
Okay.
Now, yeah,
This
some...
one feels darker, and I was thinking,
Right, there
going
are...
to these theaters, is there really any light?
There are. There's like, you know, there's carpenter or like, you know, contractor lights that are up usually, because most of the lighting is just gone. So they have lights available that are there. And so, yeah, it's more moody, it's darker. So you're not seeing all the beautiful textures of the walls as well, and the Beaux-Arts architecture elements into the painting. So sometimes I try to, you know, if they have doors that you can open up to have natural light come in, you know, I prefer that to get that variety, not only the incandescent lights, but, you know, having natural light in there too. And I was just at the Palace Theater in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and that has 2 theaters. It has the Palace and the Majestic. And the Palace they're renovating into a hotel, which is unfortunate because it's such a beautiful theater. And there was a door that I could open up where I could have light coming in, but most of the space was just like, you know, them putting up light bulbs temporarily to have, you know, people come in and start to gut the theater. So
do you try to invent your own kind of mood, or do you just live with the light that...
No, that's a good question. No, sometimes I'll make it darker, you know. So I have, again, just knowing the color combinations that are happening on the surface of the walls compared to the floor, to the ceiling. By making those notations, yeah, I can go darker. I can make it darker, moodier, compared to, you know, maybe from a photograph. You might not have that flexibility. I could add elements into it. So, yeah, that's a very important part of the process, is just not copying something. Not that observation is not a big part of my work, but also having that flexibility to do other things if I want to make the painting going in a different direction, or, you know, leaving out the seats here because I didn't want that activity happening in this area, you know, because there's so much going on here in terms of the plaster work and the decorative elements. So I wanted to have some spaces in the painting where the viewer can breathe and not be overwhelmed.
Right. I have a question, because they were talking about your teaching career. What kind of subject matter do you introduce to, you know, young painters who probably haven't done a lot of art?
Oh, that's a good question. We do very simple still lifes at the beginning, and we do black and white so they can get an understanding of value. And then we start to work on an old master painting, because it's, you know, with a limited palette, so they're only working with yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and ultra blue and white. Okay, so this gives them, they're not overwhelmed by too many colors on their palette, and they have to start to struggle and making like a representation of a Corot or a Hopper. So, and I do that so they get an understanding of color, and then they start to look at the artist and how they're starting to use the brushwork So depending if it's a building or landscape, so they start to execute that brushwork. So the next painting, which we might go back to a still life, or we might do something from their own choosing, like maybe a landscape, they have that information like, oh, Hopper did this, or Corot did this. So they treated the mountain this way, or they treated the trees like this. So just having that information and learning about the brushwork, I think is very valuable.
Do they see your work?
Yes, I always show them at the beginning, so they have a clear understanding of like what I do and what I'm interested in, and I think that opens up more conversations, especially to my serious students that want to do other things, like how do you do a career in art, all those things that are very scary for new artists, or people. Even in Penn State, because I have a lot of Asian students coming in, and they don't look at the profession as a real profession. But then then they're in my shows and they make money because some of the professors purchase the work, and they're like, oh, really? You can make money after this? And so it changes the dialogue, and like, yeah, this is really serious. It's just not something I do as a hobby. So yeah, so you have that conversation, right? Yes.
Which paintings are your favorite?
Oh, they're all my favorite. They're all my babies, just like you. You're more special, though. Yeah, they're all things I've always really wanted to paint, and I've been attracted to. And I'm always constantly getting more information from different subject matter. So this never stops. And if I see something I like, I have my camera, I have my sketchbook, I make notations, and I wait. I might wait 6 or 7 months. Am I still interested in that same image that I took, or the sketches that I put on my sketchbook? Does it still have that excitement? And if it does, then I know that this is something I want to create. Or it's just instant. Like I just got to paint that. Yes.
Do you ever exhibit sketches as completed artwork?
No, because they're more studies. They're more for me, and so. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think they're more just ideas, and so I want to display them because it's just my personal, and especially I want to make sure because I usually have a lot of paintings, so I want to make sure that they're being well represented. But yeah, that's an interesting question because if you look at Wyatt's work, he'll have sketches on the floor and they're doodles, and a lot of them he'll throw away, and then maybe keep 1 or 2 to show the process of what he created of whatever subject matter. So yeah. So, questions? Any more questions about the work?
I read in the materials that you were a set painter for the Metropolitan Opera.
Yes, yes.
How does that interact, that history that you have interact with?
Well, I love the theater because I got access to the Metropolitan Opera, and going in the backstage was incredible in terms of what the rotating stages they had, so all that environment. That was before I started taking images, well, some images of the theaters. I was doing that, but at the Metropolitan was great because you had that flexibility too. Like I explained, as being a scenic, you would work maybe for 3 or 4 months, and then you would have some time off, and having that time off allowed me to work on my own work. But working on the sets and working on the big drops were exciting, yeah, because everything's on the floor, so you have these bamboo sticks, and you're painting standing up, contrast to having the image on, on the wall or on an easel. So yeah, very different. You have big buckets of paint, so and everything is marked out, so you know what you're doing. Yeah, and
very large scale.
Extremely large scale, yeah. And you're working in the summer mostly because that's when they do all the work compared to like the fall, where you're kind of making touch-ups on certain drops or certain productions and things like that. So you're like in the summertime, you're working all the time because they're getting ready for the season. But yeah, and the same thing with the movie sets too. So you would do marbling or wood graining, or you would be just throwing dry or compound on the wall to get textures for certain movies. So yeah, it was very laborious, but it was fun to see the progression because you had the people building out the stages, the wood department, and then you came in and started to do all the finishes and all the tile work and all the marbling, and then set would come in and start to put all the the tables and the chairs and so forth, and then you would actually maybe see them filming, so, and all the extras coming in. So it was great to see that transformation of those certain sets.
Did you design sets?
No, I'm not in. Yeah, yeah. I was more of the just working on the set. That's a good question.
How did you get involved in that?
My friend was a scenic, so, and then he told me about it, and then I was actually washing buckets first and doing that type of work, and then I graduated to being able to work with the scenics. So it was a progression in order to get into those situations where you could really showcase your talents.
So somebody's done the drawing, but how do you know what they want it to look like? I mean,
Well, you have visuals, you have mock-ups, and and so you have an idea of what, and you're working with several people, so you're like, okay, we're just going to do straight painting here, contrast to like wood graining here. So yeah, everything is really well thought out in terms of how you're executing whatever for the stage work and the movie sets, and you're working long hours.
Have you acted?
No, no, but it's fun to see the Robert De Niro or having breakfast with Angelina Jolie and all that kind of
I
stuff.
to take us off on this, but I just saw Joker yesterday, and I saw Robert De Niro.
Right,
I can hardly wait to find out whether he liked the movie.
right.
I actually did.
Right. And by also being a part of that, I got access to like the Brooklyn Navy Yard, so that got me into like all the abandoned buildings in that area, and like Admiral's Row, which was all the officer quarters, and they've been like deteriorating for years. So you get access to a lot of these spaces that are not for the public, and by having that on the weekends, I would go and take my camera or sketchbook and be able to hang out in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And then of course my grandfather lived in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, so he was there during World War II, so there's that connection. So it's always fun, being part of New York and knowing the buildings. Like, you go into some of these spaces and there's like, oh, this is where the Iwo Jima monument was constructed. So, and you get that right away from the people who are working there and so forth. So, yeah, it's a lot of fun to know that there's so much history there, and I'm so involved with that, especially like living in Italy and living in New York and the grittiness and all that. So the graffiti, all that, just
Sounds like material for a book.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I love. So, like I said, being in New York was very reminiscent of like living in Italy, just because of the textures and the graffiti and the different neighborhoods and how distinct each one was. And so, yeah, and that's all kind of disappearing. Yes.
Which painting was the hardest to paint?
Ooh, you have good questions. Of course, it's my daughter. That's hard. I think the Ever Theater was one of the more challenging pieces. I just executing. There's so much information that I'm looking at, and like I'm trying to figure out what's important, where my eyes are attracted to in terms of maybe the box seats compared to the stage, So I think editing was the most challenging on this piece. So, good question. Yes.
So is that the only landscape in the show?
Yes, yeah, hike.
Can I ask do you ever paint on site when you paint landscapes?
Well, again, I'll just do little notations and things like that, but not something that I wouldn't want to do. I always love working from life if you have the opportunity. So, yeah, I mean...
With the landscape, you don't have the same question of people asking you what you're doing or...
That's true. Except for the animals.
You actually can paint like that,
Right.
But that one was not painted?
No, that was painted in the studio,
Okay.
so, yeah.
The same technique, basically, photographs and sketches and...
Yeah, and like playing around, like again, like the foreground, like with the rocks, I kind of like made that a little bit more soft and subtle compared to what's happening in the background. So having that dialogue between those two areas of the painting is, having that conversation, and especially where the light is filtering in, kind of like in the center of the painting, and having that drama, that sliver of life coming into to the foliage. So, yeah.
Did you choose that painting for this show, or did the gallery?
No, I chose it because this was a painting that was fun to do because it took like a couple years because I was doing a lot of the urban landscapes. So I would take this out after a show and work on it for a while just to relax me, because I think after a big exhibition I start to do some just fun paintings for my daughters or and things like that. And the landscape was one of those. It was totally different compared to working in the interiors or the urban landscape. So yeah, because I've always wanted to do large landscapes, but and that gave me the opportunity to work on this one for a couple of years, without the pressure.
How do you decide the price, and which is the process that's involved in this?
The pricing of paintings? Well, I think it's the size, and it's also how much time I'm spending on a piece. I think that's a variable. And then it's just, trying to have something that's reasonable to the public, and because some pieces are very special to me, but I think with the amount of work, especially like Manhattan Bound, this took us several years to do, just because of the intensity of all the water towers in the buildings. So I think time, labor is a big factor in determining the price of the work. Yes.
You said you leave something and come back to it.
Right.
Do you need to leave it where it won't be too difficult to match the color when you come back? Or
Oh, that's not a problem. Once you, and especially in the summer months, when I'm on a rhythm, like that's not an issue. It's it's just making sure it's feeling what I want out of a
you can
painting.
just mix right back to the exact color.
Oh yeah. So like, like if you ever know about Sargent, John Singer Sargent, he would spend hours mixing his palette up, because he wanted all those different variations of value. So if he was working from a portrait or a cityscape or whatever, he could move quickly. That's why his paintings are so dramatic in terms of the brushwork and so forth. So he's not even thinking about color, and compared to artists like Ewan Uglow. I don't know if you know his work. He's like an English painter. Everything's very methodical. He's really mixing up that paint. It's like really struggling to get those values correctly, and it's totally different feel in terms of the painting. So it depends on what how you start to set up your palette. If you have more variations of value, you can move quicker because you have those different values on your palette to what you're matching, whatever you're looking at.
You bring up Sargent. When you look at his paintings, it's obvious that he somehow knew what the eye would make up and what it needed to see. So he could do all these things that don't look like anything close up, because evidently he knew what the eye would supply. Do you think about that when you paint? I mean, the detail you can leave out because the eye will put it in?
That's a good question. I mean, when I'm working, it's a lot of it's intuitive, like like what I see as well as what I want to get out of it. It's more about the feeling of like trying to get that feeling correctly in the painting. So similar to him, like if he's working on fabric or the skin tones, it's all about getting that feeling 100% correct as well as observation. So it's like that balance in between. If that answers your question. Yes.
I know which painting is my favorite.
Okay, what's your favorite painting?
The donut painting you did for me on my birthday.
Okay, the donut painting. Food. Very good. Yes.
Have you ever painted your daughters?
Yes, I have. I painted Evelina, and I haven't painted my other daughter yet, but I'm going to be working on a portrait of her soon. So yes. Yes.
Not to dwell on the negative, but what would you say is your Achilles heel as an artist? Is there anything that you find particularly frustrating in the element of technique?
Oh yeah, everything. It's when you're working on a painting, there's a lot of ups and downs, and like I don't know what I'm doing, or you can't see the painting at times. And also your life, whatever's coming in from the outside world, kind of penetrates that your studio, your bubble, your little cave. So I think that all plays a part. I think there's times where you just got to let the painting alone and let it breathe. And by having no time limit on any painting, I think that's has allowed me to be able to create quicker. Also, when I lived in New York, I'm living with all my paintings, so it's all screaming at me at once, right? So when you have like a studio space that I have now, and I can just shut the door and go home, and there's that dialogue is not in my head, it's not right in front of my face. I think having that distance allows me to relax a little bit and go back to the studio the next day. Or there are days where I just can't wait to go back to the studio. Like I just don't want the day to end, because you're just having so much fun. Everything is moving around beautifully, and then you come back the next day and you're like, what? Like this is not right again. So like, yeah, there's constant that struggle, and that's why I love Hopper's work, because there's such a struggle in his work. And as a painter, you can see that fighting going on, and even Bernard. Like there's it's not as easy like Sargent, which is like he has so much talent and everything is just very fluid in his work. You don't see that struggle as much as you do like with Hopper and some of the other artists, which you can relate to. So yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say that one of the moments of high that I enjoy most about painting is when I think I've lost a painting, but then I determined that not to worry.
Right.
It will get saved.
Right.
In the beginning, when I first started painting, if things didn't look like they were going in the right direction, I would get angry.
Right. Oh yeah.
Just say, no, I'll just go I'll go watch TV for a half hour or something.
Right. No, that comes in. Yeah. I think because you're very passionate about what you're doing, and there's moments where you get extremely angry at your work or yourself, and you have
to expect that I'm going to be disappointed in my work, and then not to worry.
Right.
I'll get back there.
Exactly. Yeah. Very good. So, any other particular painting? Yes.
In my observation of myself and other artists, I really find that period of struggle where you're thinking this is the worst piece of junk ever done to be essential.
Right.
What do you think about that?
I do. I like that struggle. I like that fight in the painting. And how it kind of creates this other narrative going on, that dialogue. So I think there are paintings where you pump out very quickly and they're very successful. Others don't. But I think it's just, having that confidence and going, okay, I'm trying my hardest. It's not like I'm going in there trying to make a bad painting, and just being aware of that, and having that flexibility and realizing you need more space. It's going to take more time to see it. It might take a couple years. It might take another couple of days. So I think just being flexible and having that approach leads to more success compared to being so angry at yourself that you becomes paralyzed. I've had students that do that, and I think I've had that earlier on in my career. But I think as you know yourself more as a person and as an artist, I think those things can be controlled a little bit more. So, yes.
Do you do a detailed sketch, especially in these architectural things with all the perspective?
Yeah, I do some sketches. I did some sketches of the Everett Theater here, so that was very involved. So I made sure I did some charcoal sketches of that just to get the value and the direction of how the light is. And like I said, I went back several times, so I had different times during the day, different times of the season. So for instance, like my first time coming to the Everett, it was like a rainy day, so everything was really, really dark in there. So compared to like the summer, which was a summer day and it had more light filtering in. So yeah, I do different types of sketches depending on how the light and the time and the season and what I'm attracted to. So I'll start to do sketches and then I'll go, oh, I'm more attracted to this piece. Why, and I give my time space too, so I can look at it and figure out if that's the image and how the light is filtering in that space. That's the direction I want to go for that particular painting. Yeah.
Have you done any painting with 7 artists working on the same painting?
I think we did that in college. I think there was an exercise that we actually did that. We flipped each other's works around. So we worked from the model from like the beginning of the morning, and then someone had to take over. So we've done that exercise. Yeah, it's a little frightening sometimes. Yeah. Yes.
Where's the next place you're interested in exploring and poking around? Obviously, you like.
Oh, I have a lot. Yeah. Well, there's Katz Deli in New York that I've been like going in and taking images of that space a lot. And of course, the Majestic Theater in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I was there twice and I shot that over the summer. And the projector rooms are amazing because they have all the projectors that are there. Because a lot of times these theaters that I go into, I go in the projector room too, and it's always usually sold, or it's very desolate up there. But by having the projectors in there, it just brought a charm and so forth. So there's a lot that I want to do with the Palace Theater. So that's another big project. And yeah, there's an old bathroom because I was working down in Philadelphia. So we were working down in City Hall, and they had this awesome bathroom, this men's bathroom that was just this awful green and white, and it's so old school, but I took a number of images and I want to do a painting of that. So it's just, you never know what's, where you're working, the environment, like, different areas of the building. You might see something that really captivates your interest. And so a bathroom, for example, that's fun for me. It's something that's in there that it's a men's room, so you have that, that dialogue that's happening in there. So yeah, it's just, you never know what's gonna trigger. Yes?
How come you didn't bring all your paintings in here? Like all your star keeper paintings and the donut painting?
Because, you know, that's a separate series, so, you know. Food and Star Wars are separate series. I like that.
Your daughters like to paint because of your influence?
No, I don't influence at all. I don't tell them to paint. You know, I don't want to do that to them. But because they come to my studio, and my wife's a decorative painter, so she does a lot of beautiful finishes with plaster work and a villa, and she does a lot of, you know, so we have a beautiful studio, and they're always there, and they're, you know, of course they're going to be affected by their environment, but we don't push on it to them, you know, like this is, you need to be,
Implying that.
you're right, but
I was wondering if they fell in love with painting by watching how much you enjoy it.
yes, I think so. I think they love coming to my studio and seeing the progression of paintings, and I show them artists, and I try to, like, you know, encourage them that way. So, and yeah, I think they've taken to it. They're very creative, and we try not to give them cell phones or anything, so they use their imagination like how we grew up, looking out a window instead of looking on a screen. So I think that, yeah.
Is your studio separate from your house? It's not like...
Yes, so that's one thing about living in Hershey compared to living in New York, and, you know, actually having that separation I think is so important as an artist. So, you know, you can close the door and leave that behind you and then come back the next day and be refreshed. And I love painting in the morning. You know, I think in the afternoon I get tired, and then at night or like around like 4 or 5 o'clock I'll start to get going again. And I remember listening to Lucian Freud and how he paints. He like paints in the morning, and then he goes, has lunch and takes a nap, and then he comes back and works from like 5 to like 9 o'clock at night. So I think everyone works differently. You know, some people like to work at night, contrast to early morning, but I just feel more alive in the morning and I'm ready to go. So
Do you have daylight lights in your studio?
yes, I have. Yes, I have light coming. Yeah, yep. It's nice. It's very helpful. So, yes.
How about Portland? Is there some place you're down painting Portland?
Well, I always like going down to the Harbor Fish Market, and I want to do some night paintings. I know that's something that's probably been painted forever, but there's something about the stinkiness of the environment and just like the textures and the color. And I was just down there yesterday, and I'm just looking at all the like the blues and the pinks that are happening with the buoys and things like that. So, or the lobster pods, like there's this bright pink compared to the blueness of the boat, and just going at certain times. But there's consignment shops that I'm very interested in doing paintings of. Just the one that's right across from the main College of Art. It's now a jewelry store, but it was a consignment shop right next to the art store. And I've always loved being in that. I've been taking pictures of that until she closed up maybe 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So, yeah, so that's something I'm interested in painting. The what?
That would be in the mechanics hall.
The
jewelry store?
Right. Yeah, and upstairs there's actually... Yeah, I've been up there. There's a library, and then there was a dance hall, and then I think at the top of the floor there was where all the Civil War soldiers came in to recoup. And so I wanted to get into that space because I saw that from the street. It's like, what's that? That's kind of, you know, so that grabbed my attention, and I just went into the building. So, yeah. So those are, and then there's an old gas station on Route 9. That's an old, like, I think it was an old Gulf, but I've been taking night shots of that, and just the clutter in his office space is just overwhelming. So I think it's just the craziness of that, and especially at night, and the reflections, and you know, that's something I kind of want to start to work on as well. That's local, and of course doing landscapes of Maine. If I have some time to be up here in the summer where I can start to explore, when they get a little bit older, we can start to do more hiking, and yeah. I'd love to do some landscapes.
I like live music,
Who is that? Your daughter?
Yeah, that's my daughter. That's Eliza.
Have you done any street art?
Like graffiti, like on buildings? No, I haven't done any of that. But yeah, I mean, I had.
Because once I have this perspective of the urban, paintings, buildings and all that. So
right.
Like, have you tried anything like that?
The graffiti, yeah. It's a total.
Graffitis in a couple paintings.
Oh yeah, I mean, I love the graffiti, and it's something that's always attractive. But I haven't actually physically tried to go to buildings and start tagging buildings myself. Yeah. So yeah, I haven't done that. But I'm more interested in like trying to capture these spaces, because the area, like the Divine Lorraine Hotel, that's been renovated, which thank goodness, because that's a beautiful, beautiful structure down in Philadelphia. But a lot of my places are like disappearing quickly. So anytime I'm out, you know, going back to some of these places, I want to make sure I got the images and drawing the sketches and so forth, because quickly things are developing, excuse me, in New York and Philly. So they're kind of going quickly.
Consider yourself a good photographer too?
Yeah, I think so. I'm decent, you know. So, you know.
And always you try to represent like 100% of what is in the picture, or?
No, not all. I mean, I use that as a guide. So yeah, so it's definitely, visuals are important to me, but not only observation is very important to me, but also trying to get the feel of what I want to capture the most essential. That's the ultimate goal. So like again, like I'll start to blur areas of the building. So again, you have that variation. So there's other focal points. So you're not just concentrating on one particular area and you can't move around the canvas. So. Yes?
I think it's evident from your work that you're a master draftsman, i.e. if you wanted to, you could render any of these things practically indiscernible from a photograph. That said, you take a more interesting route in infusing with your abstract vision.
Right.
As a teacher, have you ever run into loggerheads with a student in which they're perceiving, where you feel they're infusing a lot of abstraction into a work, but sort of ignoring the basic fundamental rules of perspective and everything else like that, but they're doing it in a way that essentially they're saying they're mistaking mistakes in fundamental elements of painting as abstraction. You have to rein them in.
Yeah, I mean, as a visiting artist, because that's a little more challenging because I don't know the student so well. I mean, when I'm teaching like students at E-Town and Penn State, we're doing more, you know, traditional, formal, you know, subject, not subject matter, but like principles, and I want them to get a understanding of the foundation. But when I start to do visiting artists, yeah, there's that going into those studios where they're throwing certain things that don't work, and you know, for me, it's always like where my eyes are going that are just, it doesn't feel right, it doesn't look right, and if I can't move around the painting, I try to help them like, okay, this is some problem areas. It might be the color, or like you said, the perspective that's wrong, and they have to start to adjust that to make sure that, you know, it's working cohesive with the whole painting. So I mean, yeah, because anytime you're working on a painting, even here, if you're working in this area over here and you make this more of a focal point, it's going to affect that part. So you're having that, you know, that dialogue, that internal dialogue with the work, and sometimes it's helpful for the student to see that. Sometimes they don't. I mean, because they're so immersed in their work, and it's frustrating. I totally understand their perspective. They're like, no, it's got to be this way. But then, you know, maybe 6 months down the road, they might go, oh, he was right, or you know, so it might not be, you know, immediate, but it might start to have that, you know, it might happen later on in that conversation when they're starting to work on other paintings. And I do that too, because a lot of some of these when I'm as a visiting artist, they're doing these gigantic paintings, right? Monumental paintings, and they're so frustrated. I'm just like, no, you're killing yourself. You're doing it so large, the scale, and you should be doing smaller paintings and make like a series and develop quicker. Because if you start to set yourself up with a larger scale painting and it doesn't, you know, it's not working, you know, it can destroy an artist, and then they get very angry. But if you have a series of paintings or about a certain subject matter or whatever, and you're doing smaller paintings, you can quickly get to solutions that you can maybe incorporate it into a larger painting. So I try to have that conversation with them so they can go at it a different way, because I see a lot of that happening. They want to make this big monumental painting and it's so overwhelming, and and then it starts to fall apart, and it's smarter to do smaller paintings first to really figure out, and then once you have those ideas, you know, you have a good direction, then do a larger painting of it and see how it's different, you know, the scale of it. So
it's important nothing jumps out.
The what?
It's important nothing jumps out.
No, that's not a problem, having something jump out, but it's got to work with the rest of the painting, you know. So, you know, it has to have that feel that it's correct. It's just not having something jumping out and it's overwhelming you. You know, you want to have other areas of the painting working together as a cohesive work of art. Okay. Questions?
Are there any more questions? Should we wrap it up?
All right, thank you. Well, thank you for coming out. It's a joy talking about the work tonight.